spaces in a minute. But first we're going to have a quick quiz as I move on to my second example, which is the case of water. So I need a percentage number to this, to each of these, and a percentage answer to each of these questions. And if you're to the nearest 5%, you'll get a chocolate from our lovely assistant Vicky here. So, in a representative sample of Wollongong households, what proportion claim to always avoid keeping the tap running when washing dishes? You can yell out the answers.
10%.
80.
95.
50%.
60.
40.
100. Getting all of it.
72.
64. Give it to Sol. Turn off the tap while cleaning their teeth.
90.
63. Again, in a representative sample of Wollongong households, what proportion plan to always wait for a full load of laundry before washing?
50.
56. Diego. Try and reduce the number of showers they take in a day. 30. Did someone say 40? 43%. It was over there somewhere.
No, back here. Are we ready?
Try and reduce the number of times they flush the toilet. Always.
0.
29. Who said 30? 29%. And try to take shorter showers. 25. Actually 28. Who said 25? Okay, two more questions. During the drought, 2002 to 2009, how much did Wollongong households reduce their consumption of mains water under the influence of water restrictions and the associated campaigns?
80%.
23%.
90.
80%.
23.
75. 60.
10%. Okay, what about households? Focus, everybody. What about households with tanks? How much did they reduce their consumption of mains water over the same time period? Who knew the answer? 10%. We'll come back to that number in a minute, but there's the answers to the first set of questions. So there's some interesting questions here about whether social norms around water use in showering and toilet flushing are harder to shift than those involved in cleaning teeth and washing clothes and dishes. But the example I wanted to spend a bit more time on was the example of water tanks. And Candice Moy, who again was one of our students, undertook the first post-installation analysis of retrofitted water tanks and their effects on mains water consumption in Australia. Her study area was the Illawarra, and her paper has just been published in Geographical Research, just out this week. So, according to the policy view, there's a whole set of reasons why domestic water tanks should reduce water consumption. As we all know, there were significant subsidies for tank installation during that drought, during the recent drought, and many of us were enthusiastic participants in this. So the reasons were that the promotion materials for rainwater tanks presented them as water-saving devices. Some Bureau Stats surveys who asked people why they installed water tanks, 41% said it was to save water. And Sydney Water's modelling of household water use says that 28% of household water use is assumed to be outdoors, on gardens and cars and things where water tanks were mostly used for. But in fact, when Candice looked with the Sydney Water data at a total household sample and the 7,000 odd households who installed tanks in the Illawarra during that drought. She looked at mains water consumption for 2 years before tank installation and 2 years after, so to get rid of that sort of seasonal changes and the various things that happen in households. So the proportion that tank households and non-tank households, or the broader body of the population, reduced their mains water consumption during that period was about the same, about 10%. Now, why would this be the case? Because we would expect that water tank households, well, she did and I did, that water tank households would use less water. So what Candice did was a more in-depth follow-up study with various households and householders and talking to them, interviewing them about their water practices and their tank practices and so on. And the themes that come up in those interviews fall into two different patterns, which on the left-hand side of the diagram there are the ones she called water users, and the right-hand side are the ones who she called water savers. So the water savers are the ones who you might expect would be the people who would install tanks, people with green sensibilities, people who want to save water, particularly people who've grown up in the country and are used to living on tank water. And the water users were a whole set of people who installed a tank basically to use more water rather than to save water. And very important in this was the sense of my water. This is water that the government can't tell me what to do with. And some of the quotes from those interviews are here in the top left box. I can do what I want to do. I'm not governed by government rules. We don't have to obey water restrictions with our tank water. I think I can do that because it's my water. So what we're seeing here is a major source of friction, if you like, between a government policy of water restrictions and some householders who respond by using another government policy, tank subsidies, to use more water and in a different way. Other themes that emerged in Candice's interviews and her analyses conform to what we have called in our model of the household, if you like, or our framework of the household, discursive spaces. So the way in which people, for example, talk about not wanting to have a tank connection to the inside of the house. So why only a very small minority of people who installed tanks put them to an inside connection, even to the toilet. And there was a lot of talk about this is dirty water, it comes off the roof. So there's a whole set of discursive themes around clean and dirty, as we saw in the showering and flushing practices just before. Many people who installed tanks did so, it seems, for identity or status reasons rather than any particular change in their behaviours. This has been borne out in other studies as well in Queensland. And I think for all of us, we think of water as being part of our embodied natures and embodied spaces. So for most Australians, we have very contradictory attitudes towards water. We love it, particularly those of us in the Illawarra. We like spending time in the water. We enjoy the physicality of water. And so there's a whole set of contradictions around the fact that we want abundance and we have to live with scarcity as well. So what are the lessons in all this complexity? The full implications need to be worked through, and this is pretty recent work. Should we get rid of tanks? No, we're not arguing that. But clearly, small technology won't automatically fix any of our problems any more than big technology will. We know that water restrictions do work. They are effective to a certain level. People will tolerate rationing as long as it's fair and as long as it's policed to show it's fair. And the models on which decisions are based, including the Sydney water models, we argue, need to be developed in researching everyday life, not in terms of theoretical models about ideal behaviour under ideal conditions. So Candice's study is one of a number of cultural studies of water over the last decade or so, and with a decade of drought and a couple of wet years, it's a good time to pull those studies together and ask whether we've fundamentally shifted our cultures of urban water. And I've tried to do this in the first Oscar discussion paper, which we're actually launching tonight. I think I might just go to the conclusion, so we've got lots of time for discussion. If we go inside the black box of the household, we can identify zones of friction and zones of traction that can help us think through our sustainability dilemmas. And I've just shown you 2 examples here tonight. In other ongoing work, we're applying these approaches to driving, air conditioning and solar hot water systems, among others. The strength of in-depth ethnographic research methods is that they provide greater depth to the broad trends that we might be able to identify with quantitative methods such as surveys. So the combination of methods is really important. But the resulting complexity, I think, often confounds and frustrates policymakers. So that the challenge for all of us is to try and use these frameworks to both help identify roadblocks and also identify constructive pathways of action. So thank you very much for listening.
And we have plenty of time for questions. If anyone has a question, we'd like to use the microphone so everyone can hear. Anyone at the back?
I can probably use. I'll be right
no, people at the back.
At the back? Okay. All right. Lesley, you noted that only a very small number of households within your survey of 1,500 odd households or so actually plumb the water inside their houses. I guess, do you think you might reach some different conclusions if you're able to sort of stratify and filter out the houses that made the connections to both washing machine and toilet? Because you've got higher levels of subsidies by doing that from Sydney Water, and perhaps, you know, we could change this whole way of urban water usage. Perhaps if we, you know, increase those subsidies or provided further education that plumbing, rainwater tanks to toilets, washing machines and dishwashers, you know, is sort of not going to be harmful or whatever to the household.
Yeah, thanks, Eva. So the figure comes from Sydney Water of the households who installed tanks. I think it's 16% have some indoor connection, whether it's toilet or washing machine. So the other 84% have only outdoor garden connections and so on. And it's clearly an issue that you can have your cake and eat it too. So you can have a tank and keep using as much mains water as you want to. So I think there is an education role if these themes that people bring up about clean and dirty water can be addressed, but some of those issues are real issues. So I don't know, any tank people here want to comment on their tanks?
The water can stink if you have too many trees, another green thing, basically, because you get decaying organic matter in your tanks. But we noticed a huge reduction in household water use, certainly like 25% connected to the toilet and washing machine, roughly. You know, going down 150 odd litres per day on average, 100 litres a day on average.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you did the survey about water use, you're just going across individual bills people got from Sydney Water, or and are they calibrated in any way with total results for domestic water use in Wollongong as a whole? Because one of the things I noticed that the frequency of people reading our water meter seems to have decreased, and there's a lot more estimated values these days, and our inspector couldn't get into your fierce dog and this swarm of bees, and couldn't find the water meter, but perhaps they're saving money on water meter readings and making assumptions and things like that.
Yep.
I was just wondering whether that's calibrated.
Yeah, that's an important issue. The data came, this is raw data from Sydney Water, so, and that was part of the reason for having a two-year cycle, so it's 2 seasonal cycles. And certainly you could see, you know, theoretically they read our meter every quarter, so theoretically you should have 4 readings in a year, but that obviously, you could see that in the data that it didn't show up.
Yeah, because I know, like, I've heard people say that Sydney is supposed to have decreased its per capita water consumption as a whole. Is the same true of Wollongong?
Well, this data I'm talking about is Wollongong, but I did go onto the Sydney Water website the last few days just to check what's happened in the last couple of years. And so there was a big increase in per capita water usage going into the drought, which has been maintained in the last 2 years. But whether that's just because no one's needed to water their gardens really in the last couple of years, and the practices inside the house could well have changed, we don't know. So the question of the quality of the data is a very important one. But this is Sydney Water's own data, which we had to go into, and we were stunned that they have not apparently analysed it in this way themselves. So I'm sure there'll be more comparative work to be done, but this is a very important first step, we think.
I'd be curious in the percentage split between the country background true believers who actually did save water and the eco-driven people who